Hey, whole Bible readers, it's week 37. There is a lot happening this week, so let me get right to it because I've got a lot. This is my second take, so I've got to get it in at a reasonable amount of time, right? You don't have all day for this. All right, John, quit flapping your lips. We're in the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to finish it this week and begin the Gospel of John. We'll get to Luke later so we can put it together with the book of Acts, which is a relationship that we'll talk about when we get there. So, what is Mark doing in the second part of the book? He's really helping us see how the story of Jesus comes together around Jesus' death. All the Gospels are doing this. Mark, in particular, highlights this in a way that we see the grace of Jesus, which is even greater than the very, very great failure of the disciples. And the failure of the disciples centers around the fact that they and nobody else is expecting Jesus to become king by being crucified. So when Peter says to Jesus in answer to his question, "Who do you say that I am? You are the Christ, God's true king," Jesus affirms that, tells them to be quiet about it. Why? Because, well, you can't really understand what that means until after Jesus is raised from the dead, and then goes on to talk about his death and resurrection. And Peter rebukes him. Why does he rebuke the king? Because that's not how you become king, not by being crucified, probably by killing your enemies. That's normally how you become king. Well, Jesus calls him Satan, which is pretty sharp, and then says, all of you, anyone who wants to follow me, needs to take up his cross. What I am doing isn't just saving you, it's defining your way of life. Then he says, some here will not taste death until they see the kingdom come with power. Well, that's probably looking forward to Jesus' resurrection and even to his return, but it's also embracing the very next story. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John with him. We sometimes think of these as Jesus' best friends. The Gospels don't say that, but they do indicate Peter is kind of a big failure for rebuking Jesus, and James and John are about to become big failures for insisting that they would like to have a first place in God's kingdom. So he takes these failures up on the mountain. Jesus is transfigured with the glory of God, and he speaks to two of the prophets, definitely greater than the prophets he is. And when Peter wants to build 3 shrines for what has happened here, the voice from heaven, which is God, says the same thing the voice said at Jesus' baptism, but adds to it, listen to him. And what is he talking about? He's talking about his death and resurrection. Well, down below, there is a man with a demon-possessed son, and he says to Jesus, when the disciples can't cast out the demon, if you can, help my son. And Jesus says, if you can, all things are possible to the one who believes. Sometimes Jesus says things that provoke people to say things that Jesus knows other people need to hear. This is one of those occasions. And the man then says, I do believe, help my unbelief. Well, if only that kind of honesty about need and weakness were expressed by Peter, James, John, instead of grasping for greatness. So Jesus gives the man what he needs. Then we see, as we go on, Jesus says the kingdom is filled with people like children. And when a rich man comes to him and won't follow him, giving up his wealth, which is his illusion of self-sufficiency, Jesus is going to say it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter God's kingdom. But with God, all things are possible. Salvation for anyone, if it comes from God, if it comes from our own efforts, our own self-sufficiency, forget about it, right? That's why then, in talking to James and John, who want the greatest places in the kingdom, Jesus says to all the disciples that he did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. His death for the sake of us, the unworthy, is what defines our lives in terms of greatness as not being number one, but serving others as Jesus did. And so then we're going to have a blind man. Along the way, he's simply going to say, Jesus, have mercy on me. And Jesus will. He will give him his sight back. And the blind man, unlike the rich man earlier, he's going to follow Jesus. So all of that is setting us up. We then understand what happens when the 12 abandon Jesus, when he's arrested, when Peter denies Jesus, when he is on trial, and then when Jesus is raised from the dead, when the angel says to the women at the tomb, go tell the disciples and Peter to go to Galilee because they will see Jesus there. He welcomes back the failures. Well, then we're going to go to the Gospel of John, and we'll say more about John, but right now we'll observe it's not like Matthew, Mark, and Luke in that it has different wording and different stories that really supplement the story of Jesus. that we read in the Synoptic Gospels. And John's aim, as he's going to tell us in chapter 20, is to provoke and nurture faith. So notice that as you read chapter 1 with its prologue about Jesus, and chapter 2 where Jesus says, destroy this temple, 3 days I will rebuild it. Chapter 3 where he says you must be born again. Chapter 4 where he says to the Samaritan woman, the time is coming and now is when those who worship will worship in spirit and truth. Jesus is establishing new life for the fallen people of the world and a temple which will embrace everything. Enjoy your reading. There's lots of good stuff.